All right. Hey, everybody. I have a very special guest today. Alex Byrne is joining me today to talk about gender and sex and transgender issues. He is the Lawrence S. Rockefeller Professor at MIT. His main interests are philosophy of mind, especially perception and consciousness, epistemology, self-knowledge, and metaphysics. And recently, he's been writing on the philosophy of sex and gender. He just recently published a book, Trouble with Gender, Sex Facts, Gender Fictions. And yeah, there's a lot to dig into here. And it is, quite a controversial area, as I'm sure you're aware. So my first question is, why did you decide to jump into an area where you were almost certainly going to stir up so much controversy?
Well, first of all, thanks very much for having me on, Ray. And of course, you're a philosopher yourself, so I want to hear something about your own adventures in philosophy as far as sex and gender go. Right. So, well, one uncharitable theory is that I got into it to revive my flagging academic career. I'm pretty sure that wasn't it. So I started to become interested in the topic around 2018. Maybe I started writing something in 2017. And I think it was partly prompted by the fact that then sex and gender were becoming very hot topics within philosophy, because around 2018, Kathleen Stock was dipping her toe into these waters and writing about the then proposed reform of the UK's Gender Recognition Act, and receiving a crazy amount of flack from her fellow philosophers. So it's partly that. I'm also married to Carol Hooven, who at the time was teaching a course in behavioral endocrinology at Harvard. She later wrote a book on testosterone and was famously cancelled. That's another story. Right. So I had that resource ready to hand, and I just started to read the literature and wrote some popular things about sex and the social construction of sex and gender identity. And I really did not think that I was going to get in trouble or anything like that, because I wasn't especially interested in the social and political aspects that people like Kathleen were writing about. I was more interested in, if you like, the more theoretical or metaphysical side of things. And I thought, I as it turned out, very naively, I thought,
it was very naive.
This is, this is just going to be viewed as a, good faith contribution to the literature, but it did not turn out that way.
Right.
And also, as soon as I started reading all this philosophical work on sex and gender, I thought, well, gosh, I don't really agree with any of this, and a lot of it's quite bad. And so I thought, an outsider such as myself could really contribute something to this area. But anyway, so that turned out to be immensely naive on my part.
Well, one of the criticisms of outsiders is that, one, they, haven't read the literature, and two, that, they don't have the appropriate standpoint in which to speak on these issues, which is a common criticism, I think, from people who consider themselves to have marginalized identities. It's like, well, you are a presumably cisgender, white, heterosexual male. I'm just making assumptions
here. That's
here.
how I identify anyway.
Right. So it's like, what right do you have to come into this topic and tell trans people, how they ought to identify, or to challenge the validity of their identity?
Excellent points. I mean, the first charge of not reading the literature, of course, sometimes that's exactly on point. I mean, as a philosopher yourself, that there are many amateur philosophers out there who think nothing of spouting off about the nature of consciousness or something without having done the reading and without having the first idea of what sorts of theories are out there. And to the extent that they make any contribution at all, it's just reinventing the wheel. So sometimes that charge is perfectly appropriate. I think in my own case, no one has really credibly accused me of not reading the literature. I really have read the literature. I read it more carefully than many of the people who actually write on this topic in philosophy. In fact, one of my main complaints against them is that they haven't really read the literature either, in particular any scientific literature about, for example, sex or sexual attraction or autogynephilia, for example.
Right.
Just to take something dear to your own heart.
Yes,
At some point.
absolutely.
And then the other vague standpoint theory charge is, well, there are a couple of points to make. So first of all, I wasn't really, for the most part, I wasn't writing about trans people at all, or that wasn't my focus. I wrote something about why sex is binary. That had nothing to do with trans people. I wrote a paper, maybe we'll talk about this later, that was published in the journal Philosophical Studies in 2020 called Are Women Adult Human Females? And which was arguing that yes, women are indeed adult human females, contrary to decades of feminist scholarship saying exactly the opposite. That wasn't about trans people either. Trans people appeared in that paper only because they were paraded by certain feminist philosophers as counterexamples.
Right.
The claim that that women are adult human females. So I wasn't really writing about trans people. I certainly wasn't telling trans people what they should or shouldn't be doing. But also, the charge is silly anyway. I mean, if you're, for example, if you're investigating the nature of being a woman, obviously, okay, it turns out that I'm actually not a woman, but why that should put me at some disadvantage to investigate that question is obscure, to say the least. And in any event, you should give a parallel answer. Whatever answer you give to the question, what is a woman, you should give a parallel answer to the question, what is a man? So I could very well have just investigated the question, what is a man, and then just made the appropriate adjustments and said, well, that's also my theory, what it is to be a woman. So it doesn't. And again, similarly with gender identity. I mean, allegedly, we all have gender identities. So you can hardly complain that I'm talking about something of which I have no experience if I actually have one of these things.
Right.
And of course, and then just another point, I mean, it very much depends on the case, but sometimes the external perspective is exactly what you need to find the truth.
Right.
Being too close to the subject matter can be as cognitively distorting as being too far away from it. Incidentally, there's a related example with the British pediatrician Hilary Cass, who just finished her monumental report on pediatric gender medicine, and a lot of complaints from trans activists were at the point, well, she has never treated any trans patients, and this isn't an area, she is a pediatrician, but this isn't her specialist subject, this isn't her area of medicine. But of course, she was chosen precisely because this wasn't her specialist subject. She had more than enough medical knowledge to assess the literature and to talk to people intelligently about this, but she wasn't invested in one outcome or another. She had no professional stake in it. Right. And so similarly with me, I have no professional or personal stake in any of this.
I do want to return to the pediatric gender medicine later, because I know you just recently wrote a review of Jack Turban's new book. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah, free to be, understanding kink and gender identity.
But I want to stick a little bit longer on the question of sort of like the presuppositions around, the question of like gender identity and are trans women, because in my preparation for this interview, I dug up this article from back in 2019 that was published on Medium by a anonymous trans philosopher graduate student who wrote a piece called "I Am Leaving Academic Philosophy." This transphobia problem.
Yeah.
And
this is
the
Philosopher, I think.
Yes, Philosopher. Yeah. And in the piece, it says, "My gender is not up for debate. I am a woman. Any trans discourse that does not proceed from this initial assumption that trans people are the gender that they say they are is oppressive, regressive, and harmful." So I guess that is interesting that, who gets to decide what presuppositions are not up for debate, and so yeah, I'm curious your thought on that idea.
Yeah, a couple of things. Well, for a start, it's very odd to find. Obviously, that was a sort of aggressive move to try and cow people into silence. But it's extremely odd to find a philosopher saying, "Well, this is just off limits. You can't possibly question it. It doesn't really matter what it is. The whole point of the subject, or so I thought at any rate, the thing that really grabbed me when I was an undergraduate is that you really could question anything. After all, Descartes tried to question as much as he could at the beginning of the Meditations. And
Right. Well, I think part of the problem here is that I think some of these trans women within the academic world, they feel like if you say that a woman is an adult human female, you're saying necessarily that trans women are men. And then that gets you to questions of like, well, I'm going to go to an academic philosophy conference and I'm not going to be safe because there's going to be people there who commit an act of transphobia, where transphobia is, defined as thinking that trans women are men. And so therefore it cuts into these more social and pragmatic considerations in regards to safety of the marginalized communities. So it's like it kind of gets out of the world of theoretical, epistemic and metaphysical debate that philosophers typically engage in at the theoretical level, and it gets into these more like safetyism issues in regards to conferences and departments themselves, and the kind of so I guess I'm curious, like, your response to someone like, well, you're writing in the abstract that trans these sort of downstream entailment of that adult human females are women, that's the definition of women, that that is somehow going to make a trans woman uncomfortable, or it will cause dysphoria or something like that. So what's your response to like sort of that argument about safety at like conferences or in-person events or something like this?
Well, of course, there's one thing is what your theoretical views happen to be, and many philosophers have somewhat strange and perhaps alarming theoretical views. For example, one of my views might be it's morally wrong to have children, or one of my views might be well, disabled babies should be killed at birth because their lives are not worth living. Or one of my views might be there is no God, and everyone who believes in God is seriously deluded and is just wasting their life and will die with a tragically erroneous picture of how the universe works. Or another of my views might be that morality is total bullshit, that it's just a fairy story. It actually isn't true that Hitler ought not to have killed all those Jews. It's not true that he should have done, but either claim is just false. It's just as false as a claim about Santa Claus coming down the chimney. Okay, so those could very well be extremely uncomfortable views. And if I bump into you at a conference, and let's say you're some devoutly religious person, and I start shouting at you about how God is dead and you're totally deluded in the grip of some obviously false belief system, and you're wasting your life, then obviously that's going to make you uncomfortable. But there's no reason why I would do that, or why I should do that, even given my views when I meet you at a conference. Maybe we're on some scholarly panel which is debating the existence of God or something. Well, that's another issue. And if you agreed to be on the panel, or if you turned up as an audience member, then of course you should be prepared to listen to the opposing side to the case for atheism. There's nothing different, I think, in the trans case. Of course, being impolite to people at conferences, or going up to someone and saying, "You're not a woman, you're really a man in a dress," or something. Obviously, that would be extremely rude. But
well, one question is like,
these are just very different. These are just very different things.
One question might be, how far might you take that in terms of, sticking to your principles in regards to your theoretical beliefs about sex and gender. So, for example, someone might have a theoretical position in regards to, women are adult human females, and then make an additional theoretical argument to support the idea of sex-based pronouns, which one might develop a sophisticated argument that linguistically, or ethically, or pragmatically, that's like the right thing to do, is to use sex-based pronouns. So now you're at this conference and you have let's say a trans woman there, and this person, because of their theoretical beliefs, is going to make an utterance that within the sort of liberal typical establishment of university norms of discourse, that's going to be perceived as disrespectful or impolite, or transphobic, or bigoted, or something like that. So I'm kind of curious, like, how far could you take that?
I mean, I guess there are cases and cases, and one has to be as tolerant as possible. I mean, for example, as a committed vegan, I might refuse to turn up to your conference if you're serving meat at lunch, because it's just so offensive to me. And what are you going to do as the organizer? Am I making an unreasonable demand or not? And I mean, just on the pronoun case, so when I've never ever come across a single philosopher who does not use preferred pronouns in the appropriate social setting, where the use of say sex-based pronouns would get back to the person in question and potentially offend them. I mean, not even the most hardcore gender critical philosophers who I hang out with go that far. So people are just generally very polite. Of course, politeness has its limits, but for the most part, people are just very, very prepared to.
I think as someone who used to be trans-identified as a graduate student within the academic philosophical world, I can tell you from personal experience that you don't want people to be pronouncing you out of politeness. You want them to do it because they genuinely see you as a woman.
That's right.
Or a man. And so I think, in these cases of like, yes, I'm at this conference with Kathleen Stock or whoever, she is, she's going to use she, her pronouns, but for Kathleen Stock, it's an immersive fiction, which, so it's like, that might be perceived as like, unsafe or whatever. And I think, and also just getting more personal, I do think from my experience, like a lot of this is born out of a sort of just to sort of get a little psychoanalytic, it's born out of an insecurity in regards to one's confidence in one's gender identity. And so
Oh,
because
for
because
sure. Yeah.
because a lot of the time,
Definitely.
if you're transitioning like within graduate school, let's say you start off uh, you know not trans identified, and then in the course of your graduate career you sort of make that transition. It's sort of hard because everyone knew you as a past self, so it develops like an insecurity that they sort of still perceive you as your old self rather than your new self, which develops all kinds of like psychological insecurities.
Yeah.
But going deeper into the gender identity and the the question of adult human female as the definition of woman, I do want to ask you, because I read your book and I really um liked your arguments for the idea that man and woman are biological categories. So I was wondering if you could give like a quick summary of your various arguments in regards to why you think man and woman are biological categories and not socially constructed categories.
Okay, right. So, so maybe the first point to make is that the words woman and man are, as far as I know, as far as we know, linguistic universals. So every known human language, there are very, very few linguistic universals. But man and woman are two of them. That is to say, the English words man and woman have translations into every known natural language. So that strongly suggests that whatever man and woman stand for, it's whatever categories they pick out, they're categories that are of interest to absolutely everyone, across widely divergent cultures, social practices, across people with very, very different interests and social structures and whatnot. So, so already that should make you very suspicious that man and woman stand for some kind of social roles, because there simply aren't any interesting social roles that are common to absolutely every culture on Earth. I mean, of course, that's the point that that feminists are very fond of making. And then the other point is that, well, of course, you get a big hint from the dictionary. I mean, every dictionary I've looked at defines man and woman as adult human female or some adult human female or adult human male or some variant of those words. And if you just think about it for a bit, those categories, that is the categories of the mature males and females of our species, are exactly the kind of categories that you would expect to be of interest to every known human society. If you're a man, you're particularly interested in the distinction between men and women. I mean, if you're heterosexual, the distinction is sort of especially salient, and you want to be able to distinguish the men and talk about the men, because for one thing, they're potential rivals or they're potential allies. You want to be able to talk about the women because often they're objects of sexual interest. They're the ones who are going to potentially bear your children and so on. And so already it looks like it's a pretty plausible initial hypothesis that man and woman pick out those two biological categories, adult human male and adult human female, and then you could like test it further with hypothetical cases. So imagine a case in which the gender roles are reversed. I had something like this in the book, and also in the 2020 paper. There's a French short film which called Oppressed Majority, which imagines a society in which the gender roles between men and women are reversed. Women are the ones who are in charge, and the men stay at home and push the strollers and look after the babies and do the cooking and so on. And this is just very naturally described in the way that I described it. Namely, it's the men who stay at home and look after the babies and push the strollers, and if you like, wear dresses and whatnot. And it's the women who are wearing the trousers and who are in the C-suite. But if woman and man were kinds of social roles, then you would expect the description to be different. At least you describe the case appropriately.
Right.
So it's things like that. There's also other cases of, let's say, women disguising themselves as men, not for any transgender related reason, but maybe just to go undercover into the secret world of men. And this has actually happened. If a woman disguises herself as a man, becomes accepted as a man, has a man's name, everyone believes she's a man, and so on, that still doesn't make her a man. She's still a woman disguised as a man, even though she is, for the most part, occupying the social role that's typically occupied by men.
Right. So I, agree with your argument, but I'm going to play devil's advocate for the purpose of
this is philosophy
discussion. So, one might say historically that is how the term has been used as a biological category. But we're in the 21st century. There's new subcultures, new linguistic subcultures, and one might say like, well, historically that has been the definition. And if you look in the dictionary, that is the primary definition.
Yeah.
But there's this idea that sometimes concepts have multiple definitions. So right now, if I go to Merriam-Webster and look up female, definition 1B is, well, the first definition is like has to do with, capacity to bear, young and produce eggs. But that definition B is having a gender identity that is the opposite of the male. And people might argue that, well, the job of a lexicographer, someone who writes dictionaries, is to catalog descriptively how the language has been used. So even though historically it's been used to refer strictly to a biological category, language is evolving. And so the dictionary writer is just cataloging how it's used in these new subcultures. And if that subculture becomes dominant in a culture, then now we have an argument that, we're going to switch to this new gender identity definition that, sort of raises a contradiction with the original primary definition. But, some people say that it's okay to have a contradiction within a multi-part definition, definition A, definition B, definition C, and they all kind of contradict each other. And like, that's okay because, we're just sort of descriptively describing how the word is used. And so, it's used like this to refer to gender identity by the trans community. And now it's picked up by, broader, progressive, linguistic patterns in your typical liberal circles. And so this is becoming the new way to use it. So I guess I'm curious, like, how can you defend a sort of prescriptivism saying like it ought to be used in this certain way that was historically useful?
Right. Well, okay. So yeah, very good. Yeah. All you said, everything you said was right. I'm certainly not defending some prescriptive claim. I do have a prescriptive claim to make about the word gender. I mean, it's almost pointless making prescriptive claims about language because no one ever takes you seriously or sort of implements your suggestion. I mean, that's part of the problem with this enthusiasm for so-called conceptual engineering in philosophy at the moment. It's like, okay, maybe we'll get into this later. Sorry, this is a slight distraction, and sorry, I shouldn't even have mentioned it because no one will know what conceptual engineering is supposed to be. But okay, so directly to your question, I'm certainly not making any prescriptive claims. And indeed, the fundamental claim that women are adult human females is, in the first place, it's not a claim about English or language at all. Of course, it's stated using English because I happen to be an English speaker, but if I was writing in French, I would have stated it, or Swahili, I would have stated it in a different way. Stated the same claim using different words. And of course, language does change. You're absolutely right. There are numerous cases, numerous examples of how language has changed, and often shifting social circumstances results in a change in language. And sometimes, new words or phrases are introduced. That happens all the time. I mean, gender identity, for example, is a phrase that we didn't have until the 1960s. But first, I think you should be extremely skeptical of the idea that the words woman and man have actually changed their meaning. At least if you accept that for most of human history, those words and their counterparts in other languages have remained more or less constant in meaning. So there have been all sorts of human societies in the last 5,000, 10,000 years or whatever, and they've had all sorts of social arrangements, and women and men have played different roles in different societies, and indeed some of these societies have had so-called third or fourth genders, social roles, at least in the male case, carved out for feminine gay men, basically, like the Fa'afafine of Samoa. But throughout all that, at least we're assuming for the sake of the argument, despite these huge social upheavals and differences between one society or another, nonetheless, the pressure to have words that pick out the categories adult human male and adult human female has remained sufficiently high as to preserve the meanings of those words. Okay, so now we're in some mild period of social upheaval or social change as far as sex and gender goes, at least in the West, or at least in North America. There's no reason to think, just looking over history, that this is going to make much of a difference to the meanings of these public language words, which, like for the most part, are just applied as they ordinarily were applied. And then the second point is, of course, you could argue, as some philosophers have done, that the word woman still means what it used to mean, but it has now sprouted a new meaning. And according to that new meaning, trans women literally are women. According to the old meaning, they're not. Well, that's possible. I mean, I very much doubt it. I've not seen any convincing example. Normally there are like convincing examples. If you want to say that a word is ambiguous or polysemous, has multiple meanings, then there are standard ways of showing this. There are standard ways of showing that, I don't know, the word pen is ambiguous, for example. It can mean animal enclosure, or it can mean writing implement. And you can bring out the ambiguity by saying something like, I have two pens, one that I keep my pig in and another that I use to write letters. Obviously that sounds very odd, and that's one sign, that one piece of evidence that the word pen is ambiguous. The word woman doesn't pass any of those tests for ambiguity or polysemy, as far as I can tell. And also, of course, you have to explain just what the new meaning is, and that's proved notoriously difficult.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I was going to say, in regards to like the ambiguity, I mean, it is sort of dependent on like, which linguistic subculture you're participating in, because if you, if the only people you ever hang around with are other trans people, then if you say, hey, look at that woman over there, and it's like two different people of different sexes, it's not immediately obvious within that particular subculture what, like which person you're picking out, because the idea is that, well, the term refers to gender identity, and you don't know like how someone identifies until you ask them or something like this. So it's sort of, I don't know. And then
Oh, yeah, sure.
yeah, so I think, and also within the trans community, people, there's a plurality of conceptual understandings of like how some people have very different theories of what is gender identity and stuff like this. So they would say like, well, this is all kind of fuzzy and to some degree, or to some degree, or another. And then I did want to ask you about this particular approach to challenging that kind of what the trans activists would consider a biological reductionist definition of womanhood, which is that when I was a trans activist, my favorite go-to argument was a sort of Wittgensteinian quietism or something like this, or a Wittgensteinian pragmatism, such that well, it's really difficult to give necessary and sufficient conditions for ordinary language. So why should we expect that we can provide necessary and sufficient conditions for a woman when it's really hard to do it in all these other cases? And they really do believe that trans women are a counterexample to that attempt to give the necessary and sufficient conditions, because that's their their phenomenological experience that they kind of take for granted is that, well, I just know intuitively that trans women are women because I know all these trans women in their life, and I see them as women intuitively. So like that provides a justification for kind of doing some intuition pumping to provide that as a counterexample. So I'm kind of curious, like how can we be so confident that trans women are not in fact a counterexample to the attempt to spell out the precise, necessary, and sufficient conditions?
Right. Oh, okay. Well, a couple points. Okay, maybe three points. So the first point I wanted to make is that people can have. So there are like two importantly different cases. So I might, in my own personal idiolect, use cat very, very broadly so that it includes dogs. So not only is my cat Lola a dog, not only is my cat Lola a cat in my idiolect, my neighbor's dog Ruby is also a cat in my idiolect. I mean, I could use the word cat in that way. I could like write in my diary, note, here I am using the word cat to mean either a cat or a dog. And then for some reason I spew off on the number of cats I've seen that day, and how cats are quite different from one another. Some cats bark and some cats meow. Okay, that is perfectly intelligible. Maybe there's some weird subculture that uses the word cat in this way. But another possibility, or another kind of superficially similar situation, is where I'm just confused about what cats are. I could have some strange theory of cats, according to which they often appear as dogs. So, I'm wrong. So in the first case, where I'm using cat in my own proprietary way, when I point at Ruby the basset hound and say that is a cat, what I said is true in my idiolect. If I'm just under some total misapprehension about what cats are, maybe I've never like heard of the word dog or anything like that. No one has ever said that dogs are different from cats, and I've just like generalized from seeing some cats and then seeing some dogs, and I think, okay, yeah, well they look very, very similar somehow. Maybe I have like defective vision, so dogs often appear to me more similar to cats than they actually are. So I keep calling these dogs cats. Now I point at Ruby the basset hound and say, lo, that is a cat. I'm wrong in that case. So one is a case of of linguistic change. I'm not wrong. Another is a case where I'm just in the grip of a mistaken theory about what cats are. I'm just using cats in the ordinary way, but I'm quite wrong about what the cats are. So you can't. In other words, it might be that in certain communities where it's agreed that on all sides that trans women are women, these people are just wrong for like perfectly understandable reasons. It's not that they're using the word woman in some special proprietary way, so that when they say Rachel pointing at you is a woman, they're correct. Rather, they're just under some misapprehension about what women are. And indeed, I don't think this has got anything to do with trans subcultures in particular. Many feminist philosophers, and indeed many philosophers, or just like ordinary people, would agree that trans women are women. They're not using the word woman. It's transparently clear, at least in the case of some feminist philosophers who think that trans women are women, they are not using the word woman in some specialist sense or some in anything other than the normal sense. That is their view. I think they're wrong, but that's their view. Sorry, that was the first point. And sorry, remind me of the. I tried to write the other 2 points.
Well, that's sort of like that does sort of. I'm just going to jump into like a related question, which is that for the philosophers or the feminists who do believe that trans women are women, they might even assent to the idea that in the common parlance, woman refers to some degree of or some type of femaleness, but they'll just say that it turns out that once you go on hormones, you are sufficiently female such that trans women are actually
that's right.
human.
Yeah, you had a couple of other exactly. So you had a couple of other points. So one point is that, of course, as we know from doing the so-called conceptual analysis in philosophy, that hardly any words can be defined. That is, there are very few words. I mean, cat is a good example. You can't actually give non-trivial, necessary, and sufficient conditions for being a cat. And that's the rule rather than the exception. However, there are so that is a perfectly good preliminary point. If someone says, "Oh, I have necessary and sufficient conditions. I've found some necessary and sufficient conditions for being a woman," then initially it's good to be skeptical, because if that's true, then that's one of the rare exceptions.
Right.
But then there really do seem to be some uncontroversial exceptions to that rule. And interestingly, one of the uncontroversial exceptions are gendered animal words like ewe, meaning adult female sheep. No one really disputes the idea that, that's what it is to be a ewe. It's whatever. It's very difficult to define chair, but amazingly enough, it's quite easy to define ewe. So once you've accustomed yourself to the idea that the gendered animal words is one of the small class of exceptions, then it shouldn't really be surprising that the word woman has necessary and sufficient conditions. But then you were making some other point. Well, let me put it slightly differently. Or let me make a related point. You could accept that women are adult human females and yet think that trans women are women, or at least some trans women are women, because being female is a matter of having certain bodily characteristics that one could acquire by surgery or hormones or medical treatment. So that's perfectly intelligible. Indeed, some trans women do say that they're adult human females.
Right. And
in fact,
the
if
argument,
if I were a trans woman, I would not contest the claim that women are adult human females.
right. Yeah, because they'll say that in regards to the development of bodies, in the womb and growing up and going through puberty and social life, in regards to what determines primarily our sort of intuitive gendering of people, that is primarily determined by our endocrinological sex. And then it gets into this layer cake model where they have like, well, there's gonadal sex, there's chromosomal sex, there's endocrinological sex, there's morphological sex or psychological sex. And they say that the one sex to trump them all is the endocrinological sex, because, and the example they use is like, well, if you're like a trans guy, like a trans man, like a female who identifies as a man, and you're on testosterone, that endocrinological sex change at that level, that layer, is so powerful that it reshapes how everyone perceives you.
Yeah.
And then they'll say something like, well, in the case of the you, that is, that's in the animal world. But, we live in a civilization, and humans are, so much more social as creatures. We're like fundamentally social ontologically, or some sense, and such that we live in this sort of like cultural matrix. And in that cultural matrix, we define human. So they kind of carve out the human case from the animal world and say like, well, because we have these complex social rules and norms and categories, and in that cultural matrix, your endocrine sex is the thing that determines how you're perceived. And so that's an argument for saying that in the human case, the way we define male and female is like different, because we have a more complicated way of recognizing sex, versus in the case of the you, it's like more straightforward. So they just kind of say like, well, once you throw in society, it complicates everything. So now it's fuzzy. And so,
yeah, of course. Well, okay, no number of things to say there. I mean, one is that, of course, in a sense, it is complicated when you throw in society. And I mean, the case of trans men illustrates how there's no straightforward path from claims about what women and men are, in particular, that they're adult human females and adult human males, respectively, to any claims about social policy or how people should be treated or pronouns should be used or who's allowed to use what bathroom or compete on what sports team. So for the most part, I mean, not that I want to speak for my sex class as a whole, but for the most part, men have no issue with trans men whatsoever. Trans men can use the bathroom and play on the rugby team if they're foolish enough to do so, and we just like totally happy to treat them as men. It's just like no biggie whatsoever. I mean, here I'm talking about a trans man who's had some serious hormonal treatment, so they have male pattern baldness, and could very well be indistinguishable, at least wearing clothes from from
you will have some gay men though say we deserve like a single sex basis for gay males.
That's right. Yeah. So we don't want. Yeah. So there are issues if I'm organizing my my gay orgy in the woods or something, and some trans man wants to join in. But for the most part, there's just no issue with trans men, and it clearly doesn't depend on whether trans men are literally men or not.
Right. Well, in that case,
who cares whether they're literally men? It just doesn't matter.
If the definition of these things does not have entailments in regards to how we, treat people with these different social policies and pragmatic, arrangements of, bathrooms or, social policies. Then I guess one question is like, from the trans activists, they might ask like, well, why do you care so much about precisifying this definition? Because I think in your book you give the case of, a someone who's, um, go, like in terms of their gametes, they're male on the gamete account, but they have, I think, congenital and the CAS, where they sort of like, like no one finds
You
out.
mean complete androgen insensitivity?
Yeah, right. So like socially, they've been raised as women, and so in that case, it seems like that they pass the social sniff test in like every single situation.
Yeah.
And so they say like, well, in that case, why are you so insistent that that person on the gamete account is a man? Like you're gonna like walk up to their face and say you're a man. And if you're not going to do that out of politeness or social deference or to make the smooth over the social world, why are we like sitting here having this debate over these terms? Like why not just like grant like why not we just grant them this thing like
I didn't start this. Simone de Beauvoir started this in 1949.
Right.
It's not like you wouldn't have thought, philosophers have been, of course, extremely keen on asking the what is X questions since Socrates, but they've typically confined themselves to important categories like truth and justice and knowledge and so on. And so you might well wonder, well, what is the obsession with asking what is a woman? And I mean, absent for a start, feminist philosophers have been very interested in this question. I think because they had sort of convinced themselves, or they had like tacitly assumed that the biological answer couldn't possibly be correct, because then it would have this would have been sexist or biologically determinist or something bad. So therefore it can't possibly be right. And they spent an enormous amount of ink coming up with alternative accounts. And this was way before like transmania, transgender tipping point, and that just gave it a further boost, and suddenly it became more or less axiomatic. It's one of your data points that trans women are women, and so now, now we have more data. We have another piece of evidence that we didn't have before, so we can build our theories of what is a woman around that. And then there was this large, literature on exactly this topic. But I mean, my own view would be, women are adult human females. That's actually not a terribly interesting, or it's certainly not a very alarming discovery. It's perfectly compatible with as many trans rights as you want. So let's move on and talk about something else, which is a little more interesting.
I'm curious. I want to run by you an argument I made in my book, my trans activist book, many years ago.
Aggressive book, right?
Yes. So I had this essay in there called "Against the Sex Gender Distinction."
Oh yeah.
And the argument was: suppose you are an alien anthropologist from Mars, and you're coming to the planet for the first time. You have no idea, anything about, the sexes or gender or culture, total blank slate in regards to, this. And now you're doing like a sort of scientific investigation. Now, suppose the alien asks themselves, what is a woman? And then they're going around, doing some research on, trying to, observe, different patterns, and, assume that, fully passable, integrated, assimilated, transsexual women, are part of the aliens, cataloging. There's, and so the argument might be, well, if you sort of, it's like only if you assume at the get-go that trans women are not women, that you would arrive at the conclusion that these passing assimilated transsexual women are not women. But if you don't have that presupposition in your mind that trans women are not women, you're not going to be biased such that you don't count the assimilated passing transsexual women who have had all the surgeries and hormones and stuff like this. You're going to count them because socially they seem to fit into that, they're blended into the social category. And so now you're not going to arrive at the conclusion that no woman has small gametes, because to that alien who's just, who's completely unbiased, you're like, well, in this case, look, I found a woman who has small gametes. So, and so now it's sort of like, so that was sort of my argument, was like, it's like only if you approach your investigation with the presupposition that trans women are not women, that you would conclude that there's no counterexamples to the case that women don't have small gametes or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, but that's, in a way, that's a bit like, I can't remember the exact thought experiment offhand, but in a way, that's a bit like saying, look, imagine that there was a breed of dog that looked exactly like a cat. And I have one of these dogs. I mistakenly think it's a cat because it looks very much like a cat. It purrs and meows and so on. But it can't mate with other cats. It can mate, can only mate with dogs. It's only superficially a cat. It's really a dog. You can totally make sense of that story. Everyone else calls it a cat. It would be wrong as like an alien linguist to conclude that the word cat, as these English speakers use it, is truly applied to this cat-like dog. So cat doesn't stand for a certain biological species or sort of natural biological kind, because it also applies to these cat-looking dogs. Maybe cat just means animal that has the appearance of a certain cattish experience. Sorry, a certain cattish appearance, a certain feline appearance. Maybe that's what, or plays the feline role or something like that. That's what the word cat means. No, the right account of the word cat is just that it picks out a certain kind of animal, and that people in this linguistic community systematically misapply the word cat, understandably, to some non-cats because they look exactly like cats.
You base that on the fact that cats can't breed successfully with dogs, and then so that sort of provides this sort of like intuitive justification to kind of carve the nature at the joints on that basis of like the inability to reproduce. But I'm curious if you've heard of there's this trans woman named Martine Rothblatt. I think.
Oh yeah, right.
She wrote this book back in the 90s.
Founder of Sirius XM, I believe.
Yes, and some other technological inventions.
Yeah.
But she has this argument that, in the future, in the transhumanist technological future, where all children are grown in a vat somewhere, and we have this crazy artificial reproductive technology, and like no one is having regular old sex anymore. It's all artificial technology. In that sense, the distinction between males and females, based on this idea from an evolutionary sense of like, well, if you want to make a baby, you have to, a male has to get together with a female. In this new future, in the transhumanist future, that distinction is going to be, it's going to be like outdated. We're gonna grow out of it as a species.
Oh, sure. Yeah, right.
So in that sense,
feminists
would you say,
feminists have had similar thoughts, like the second wave feminist Shulamith Firestone, that come the glorious revolution, sex will be unimportant. Babies will be grown in test tubes or hatcheries. It's all very brave new world. And maybe there will still technically be the distinction between male and female. Maybe the humans will still come in male and female varieties, but this just won't be socially significant anymore.
Right.
Is that the basic?
Yeah. That's the argument.
Well, sure, you can tell that kind of fantastical story if you like. It seems to be like crazy speculation as far as I can see.
Yeah.
But,
It's funny because they're pushing for that vision.
But of course,
but
but this brings out another point that to say that humans come in male and female varieties is not to say that we should organize society around this distinction. Maybe we should try and ignore it altogether. I mean, I think that is never going to happen. It's clearly never going to happen.
Right.
Partly because one half of the population is sexually attracted, given a few outliers, is sexually attracted to the other half, and vice versa.
Right. So one thought that I've been developing recently in regards to this question of like, well, in most cases, the rule is we can't provide the necessary and the sufficient conditions, and we just kind of leave it to this kind of like Wittgensteinian pragmatic fuzziness about language games or something, and that like is perfectly adequate for most cases. Like is a hot dog a sandwich? What is a chair? But we all kind of have this intuitive understanding of like what those things are, and we're not really hot and bothered about the fact that we can't provide these necessary and sufficient conditions. But that was the case for man and woman historically, until the development of modern transgender politics. And now there's these concerns about single sex female spaces and like sports and prisons and domestic violence centers. So it's only as a result of these new social dilemmas that we have necessitated the precisification of that term for practical purposes, because now we have a pragmatic reason to really nail down and try and achieve consensus on what these terms mean, to achieve consensus on the necessary and sufficient conditions, because it provides a strong pragmatic value in terms of safeguarding, these single-sex spaces that have now, at least from the general critical perspective, have come under attack, to some degree or another. If you really care about female sports, then it really behooves you to give a good definition of like, well, who belongs in that category. So it's only now due to these pragmatic considerations that we find it necessary to give these precise definitions, whereas before, prior to the introduction of like transgender people into broader culture, it was never necessary. Even if like
I would, right. I would put that slightly differently. So I think the sex categories, female and male, are perfectly fine as they are. The as far as biological categories go, they're really very clear. Similarly with the categories man and woman. However, so nothing about those words needs to be precisified. They're totally fine as they are. Of course, as with almost every word, there are going to be borderline cases. So, almost every word is vague. Or take the word mug, for example. This is definitely a mug. This is definitely not a mug. But you can find some intermediate cases where you think you're inclined to say, well, it's not definitely a mug, but it's not definitely not a mug. And then similarly with male and female and man and woman. Okay, so that's one thing. But then the other thing is the thing that you do need to do in any case is to have rule. If you're going to have sex-based categories, say for sport, typically just saying that, okay, well, look, it's this simple. The female category is for females only. All and only females can get into the female category. Typically, that won't be exactly right. So it won't be exactly right because you don't want to include females who've taken large amounts of testosterone, for example. You don't, and maybe you do want to include males. Suppose we grant, for the sake of the argument, that someone with complete androgen insensitivity syndrome is technically a male, even though being phenotypically, socially, physically, at least as far as athletic prowess goes, female. You would want to include those people into the female category. So, I guess I think of the problem slightly differently. That these entirely serviceable categories, especially for the purposes of biology, male and female, and these entirely serviceable categories, man and woman, for many social purposes, are not exactly the categories that you need. So extra rules or supplements need to be added. But it's not a question of of redefining the terms male or female or making the categories more precise. It's rather just adding riders or qualifications. Yeah, sure, any female person can compete in the female category unless you've taken large doses of testosterone or something like that.
Right. I do want to jump into the topic of conceptual engineering
Oh, sure,
because
yeah.
I think, if you listen to how Judith Butler, she's been doing a lot of interviews and book tours about her new book. And, the point she always, uh, brings up in regards to what is a woman is like the question of like power and the cultural hegemony of like European colonialism and imperialism, and sort of the sort of the like implication is that it's these white Europeans who like imposed power onto for example indigenous cultures, impose the binary and impose these reductive biological definitions. And so the idea is that because the transgender community is interested in political liberation, we have a ethical motivation to challenge, what they would call like cis normativity, or like challenge these dominant, paradigms of like power. And so even if like historically these terms have been used to refer to biological categories, because these have impacts on marginalized people, and framing the questions of philosophy of like, well, who gets the right to decide what these terms mean? Well, and we ought to bias ourselves towards defining words in ways that maximize the political liberation of like the most marginalized in our community. And so the argument goes that transgender women are the most marginal, pretty much any social category on the planet. And so we ought to just defer to whatever is going to maximize their political struggles, or something like this. Or that's sort of like the gist of how I understand the project of conceptual engineering. I'm not sure if you have a different.
Yeah, although I don't know, I didn't really think of Butler as a sort of conceptual engineer. I thought her main point about, or her main claim about the meaning of the word woman is that it just means multiple different things. And
Right.
well, who knows what it means really. The category is sort of essentially unstable, so
right.
you can't really. I mean, there was some interview once, like years ago, where she actually denied that she herself was a woman. So, at any rate, on her view, it's not really clear whether claims about women and men make very much sense. I mean, at various points, she seems to think that one of the great discoveries of feminism is that categories like woman are sort of essentially unstable, You can't really compare the category. You can't compare women as we know and love them to women back in ancient Greece, or women in North American cultures before Columbus arrived, or there's just no universal category that applies to all cultures and all times. And that's a bit different from the conceptual engineering thought, which is that, as I understand it, okay, the word woman might have a perfectly definite meaning. It might mean adult human female, but that category is now not suitable for various purposes, or maybe it doesn't advance the cause of trans liberation if we have a name for that category. So we need to reconfigure the word woman so that it picks out some other category instead.
Right.
And I mean, one problem with conceptual engineering is that it does very much resemble, I think, a bunch of college students getting stoned late at night and drawing up plans for flying saucers or driverless cars or Martian spaceships or something like that. It's all very well, but it's all like fun. But of course, no one is ever going to put their plans into action. No one is actually going to build something that they sketched out on their.
I mean, except like the Democratic Party and the Human Rights Campaign and HR departments at like giant corporate, like diversity trainings and like nonprofits and within the halls of academia themselves. So it does seem like this conceptual engineering, it is taken up. It has been taken up by these progressive institutions that have a lot of cultural power. So in that sense, I would say that these are not just random stoners waxing philosophically, where these ideas never get out into the world. To some extent, I think this conceptual engineering has leaked out into the broader world, such that you see it in every single HR training, diversity course you take. I mean, I work in corporate, America, so I'm well aware that this stuff is not just contained within the halls of academia. So
right, no, that's right. What I meant with the analogy was that it goes back to the point you were making about dictionaries. It's not within corporate America's power to change the meaning of English words. It's within no individual person's power, for sure. It requires like a huge mass of us suddenly altering our linguistic usage in certain ways. So no amount of trans glossaries defining woman in this or that way is going to change the meaning of the common English word.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to push back. I'm going to push back on you on that, because I think, I can imagine a situation where I'm not sure how long that secondary definition using gender identity has been in the Merriam-Webster, but I can imagine that decision to put that in there, whether that was 10, 15 years ago, however, I don't know when it was put in there, but it was based on a small committee, and maybe there's a couple, super woke trans activists on that committee, and because they know it's the politically correct thing to do, they didn't go out and do their typical surveys of how it's used in these broader populations. They just sort of made an executive decision to sort of cater to this 1% of the population, this trans community, for purposes of political correctness. And now that it's in the dictionary, if you now the masses, when they're searching on Google for what is the definition of the term, it is having a broader impact on society at large, as a result of, actions that are taken by a very small minority. So I do think that given the proliferation of information with, like, the internet, and how you can sort of, like, I think a small group of linguistic users can have a massive impact on how language is shaped at the broader population level, such that it doesn't, it, like, we like don't have to wait until, like, we get like a 80% consensus in the population. It's just like you just need a consensus among like 5% of highly influential activists, and they can kind of, make an outsized contribution to our political discourse. So.
Right. No, that's a fair point. But when you were Rachel, and you thought you were a woman when you were Rachel, right?
No, not really. I identified as like non-binary because
But didn't you
I
describe yourself as a trans woman?
that was just on that book.
Oh, I see.
But pretty much as soon as that book was published, I stopped identifying as, that was like the subtitle, a trans woman's
Yeah.
perspective on gender.
Yeah.
But my reason for rejecting, or to not identifying as a woman, was because I was well aware that it was impossible to define womanhood outside of biological reductionism in a way that was non-circular. And I just, because I was at the time on Twitter arguing with, gender critical people and philosophers, and I knew if I identified as a woman, I would get this question, okay, well, you identify as that. Well, what is the thing you're identifying as? And I knew that the only way to give a like answer to that would be to refer to some sort of like gendered stereotype in regards to, like, well,
Yeah.
I like a particular type of clothing, or I'm more emotional, or I'm more sensitive than typical males. So it's like I sort of knew enough to know that, like, it was an unanswerable. It was like kind of, what people might consider like a gotcha or whatever, because it does get you. It
Yeah.
does get you. It is a good gotcha. Not all gotchas are good gotchas, but that's like the like, what is a woman? Because it's the accusation of circularity. I was like sensitive to that, and because I wanted to like have a philosophically defensible identity, I identified myself as like trans feminine, which was, I could define,
Yeah.
more reductively, because it's like a male who's on this feminizing pathway, which, I could define all that terminology in a sort of non-controversial, non-circular way. But but that was like a defense mechanism against like these like engagements I was having with like the like gender critical world and like Twitter and all these online spaces and stuff.
Yeah. Right. Okay. But my impression is, I mean, at least for some trans women or trans men, they think that they are women in just the ordinary sense of the term. It's not that they're women in some specialized sense of the term, or that, okay, they aren't women, but really we should alter the meaning of the word woman so that it now truly applies to them. They, this comes out in many trans autobiographies. They always were women. Just so if you're of that mind, then of course conceptual engineering is exactly what you don't want. There's no need to change the word woman. The word woman at all. Actually, just to go back to your point about trans liberation and language, I mean, it is fascinating how language has become a kind of obsession. I mean, especially on the so-called trans rights side, as if a lot of these issues really do turn on language. But in particular, if the word woman doesn't truly apply to trans women, then that's the end of trans rights or trans liberation or something like that. But in the case of other liberation movements, language has not been so important, or just take sort of animal liberation. I mean, as far as I know, I don't know a huge amount about that literature, but I suppose you're just interested in, like, maybe not converting people to vegetarianism, but at least stopping factory farming and the mistreatment of animals. There's no need to like define any redefine any words or do any conceptual engineering in order to bring about.
I do think though that in a lot of social justice movements, like language is a preeminent concern for whatever reason sociologically. For example, like the unhoused versus homeless distinction, or in like the anti-racist movement, you have to capitalize Black. That's like a very important that's like seen as a very important like linguistic update to our discourse that has impacts on liberation.
No, that's true. Those are very good points. Although your own illustration of replacing the word homeless with the word unhoused shows in a way that these linguistic reforms are pointless or accomplish very little, because that's an example of what Pinker calls the euphemism treadmill, that you replace one euphemism with another precisely because the first euphemism, like homeless, has gained some pejorative tint. It's become negatively valent, so you replace it with another word, and of course sooner or later that becomes negatively valent.
Well, the argument that they will make that like why this is important is about the stigmatization argument. So for example, they, like a lot of the disability rights activists, want to exercise terms like crazy or idiot or dumb from our language because they will argue that it like stigmatizes people with mental illness or something like that, which it's funny because like I mean you talk to people who actually have mental illnesses, like not all of them agree that like these are things, because like a lot of people who have histories of like
that's
being
exactly right.
Literally crazy, they're like, yeah, like crazy is a great word because it accurately describes like my life. I did want
similarly with being homeless, sometimes you have to call it like it is, and like there's nothing good about being unhoused. And I mean, as it were, one way of bringing out how bad it is to be unhoused is to say, well, you're actually homeless. You don't have a home, and a home is something very valuable to have. Whereas it's somehow bloodless if you say, oh, I'm unhoused. I mean, a similar. You were reminding me of. Well, actually, reminding me of two things. So I did write a review of Judith Butler's recent book, Who's Afraid of Gender? And this philosopher who's a disability rights activist called Shelley Tremaine objected to me on Twitter. Actually, maybe it wasn't on Twitter. Maybe she wrote a blog post about it, about how offensive my review was. And her objection, she had one objection. It was a very long review, like 4,000 words or something. Her objection was not any kind of defense of Butler or anything like that. It was rather to my using the word lunatic in the review. Which she found extremely offensive. And then the other thing that you just reminded me of is this op-ed that Carol and I had in the New York Times a while ago about sex assigned at birth, and how that is viewed, at least in some quarters, or the point of that phrase is as a sort of respectful euphemism to replace male and female, which terms are allegedly offensive to some transgender people.
It is sort of deeply ironic to me, these whole like assigned male at birth versus assigned female at birth distinction, because I'm starting to see pushback in trans activist circles about that distinction, because in these trans communities that has become reified to point out the sort of sexual dimorphism of the species in a way that sort of like it's not just like the assigned, like you were assigned male and that was like some like random event that was totally arbitrary in your past. It's like, no, like ontologically you are assigned male at birth, which is essentially the saying like you will never escape that
Yeah. You'll
that
never escape
assignment.
your assignment.
And so you'll see things in the trans community. For example, a female might be posting like a job, like an advertisement looking for a roommate, and they're like AFAB only. Because they recognize that there's these like sexually dimorphic, questions about socialization. It's like, well, there's like that AFAB socialization. I'm only comfortable with like AFAB socialized people.
Yeah.
And so they've sort of on their own organically redeveloped the sex binary through what had originally intended to be a liberation from the sex binary by using the terms like AMAB versus like AFAB, and so now I'm starting to see that the pushback that AMAB AFAB is transphobic.
Yeah, no, I can see that.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, a related point, you mentioned that I reviewed Jack Turban's book, Free to Be, Understanding Kids and Gender Identity. And in that book, Turban says, okay, the preferred usage is sex assigned at birth. That's essentially what's on your birth certificate. Well, why is that? Well, he thinks because sex itself is just not properly defined. It could mean all sorts of different things. I mean, it's essentially your layers of sex that you were talking about earlier. It could mean gonadal sex or hormonal sex or neurological sex or whatever. The term is just so confusing. But here is something concrete, namely whether you have an F or an M on your birth certificate. So we're just going to talk about that.
Unless you're born in the Amazon forest, in which case,
yeah, that's right.
you don't.
That's right. Yeah, it doesn't travel too well culturally. But of course, then the next question to ask is, well, okay, but if like sex is this incomprehensible mishmash of things, why on earth do we go around putting M and F on people's birth certificates? Why do we have this like weird ceremony where it's not really based on nothing? Of course, he doesn't question that at all. But that's very closely related to your point about looking for an AFAB roommate. The fact is that having an F on your birth certificate is highly predictive of all sorts of things.
Right.
And that is, of course, because being female is this genuine, highly predictive category. You can kind of like fudge that fact by saying, oh, yeah, no, it's nonsense. But instead, we're going to just focus on the indisputable fact that someone has an F on their birth certificate. But that's just like papering over the issue, or just trying to disguise. You're just trying to disguise the fact that the sex categories are extremely important.
Right. Speaking of Jack Turban, Jack Turban has been doing a lot of interviews talking or debates or whatever, where he sort of defines gender identity and the essence of the transgender phenomenon in terms of what he calls a transcendental sense of self.
Yeah.
And you have, I think, written or talked, I saw like a talk you gave at one point where you criticized the concept of gender identity as being like immutable or whichever, which is typically, that goes back to this, like, the female soul trapped in the male body, or this transcendent sense of self that's like, you can't be defined, and it's like fuzzy, or it's not fuzzy, but it's like deeply subjective in some way. And so I'm curious, you use the case of like detransitioners as like as at least one of your arguments as to why the concept of gender identity was like fundamentally like confused the idea that like everyone has a gender identity. So I really would love to hear you articulate your argument against that. And you sort of, I think if I remember correctly, you wanted to return back to the more like original sense, which I think was Stoller was his name, who was like, it's a cognitive recognition introspectively in regards to like what your sex is, and not this more Turban as subjective sense that's totally transcendental. So I'm curious if you want to.
Yeah, that's right. No, yeah, that's exactly right. So gender identity was first explicitly defined in 1964 by the psychiatrists Robert Stoller and Ralph Greenson, who were both at UCLA, and Greenson was Marilyn Monroe's psychiatrist, as it happens. And they defined it as the conviction that you're one sex or another, the conviction that you're male or the conviction that you're female, or the sense of knowing to which sex you belong. And that is a very interesting and important notion, especially for developmental psychology, because it's a fact that children, after a few years of life, start to develop this sense of themselves as belonging to one sex or another. And it's interesting to study how this develops as they get older. And so if having a male gender identity amounts to the conviction that one is male, which in the overwhelming majority of cases will amount to the knowledge that one is male, then everyone has a gender identity. But in that sense of gender identity, in what Stoller later called core gender identity, it's quite unsuitable for defining what it is to be transgender. So normally, of course, if you turn to some glossary to find out who these transgender people are, you discover that they're the people who have mismatched gender identities. Their gender identity doesn't align with their sex or with their sexed body. And the Stoller Greenson account of gender identity won't work as a way of defining what it is to be transgender, but of course you can be transgender and be under no illusion whatsoever as to what your sex is. You can be a transgender woman and know that you're male, or you can be a transgender man and know that you're female. I mean, Buck Angel is my go-to example of a transgender man who is absolutely not shy about saying that he's female. So he wouldn't be transgender on this account. So if you defined what it is to be transgender in terms of the Stoller Greenson kind of gender identity. Okay, so if you're going to go that route, then you need another account of gender identity. And it's proved, as far as I can see, almost sort of impossible to explain what this other kind of gender identity is, let alone to argue that it's something that everyone has. So in Turban's case, it's all a bit complicated, but essentially, as you were saying, it seems to boil down to what he calls a transcendent sense of your own gender. So if you take a butch lesbian who identifies in some sense with masculinity and is maybe frequently mistaken for a man, doesn't really care if she's mistaken for a man, plays like the masculine role in her romantic life and so forth. She is not transgender, despite having a very positive attitude towards masculinity and in some sense identifying as masculine and so on. She's definitely not transgender. Okay, why is that? Well, according to Turban, it's because she has a transcendent sense of her own female gender. But the problem is that Turban never explains what having a female gender means. It doesn't mean being of the female sex. It means something else, but he never explains what it is, let alone argues that everyone has this transcendent sense of gender. He tries. I mean, actually, this reminds me of a similar move by Julia Serrano in Whipping Girl. He tries to make the cisgendered aware of this transcendent sense of gender with various little thought experiments or exercises. So one is, get your friends or family to mispronoun you for a few days and see how that feels. But of course, I think this is just like projection on Turban's part. I don't.
I think another
call me
common
she,
one of
her,
these,
however many times you want. It's like I don't care.
I think another one of these thought experiments is like the classic what's called the button test in the trans community. It's like, would you press a button to like switch genders or whatever?
Yeah, right.
And the trans people would do that, whereas the cisgender people are not going to do that. And that's how the cisgender people know that they're cisgender, is because they wouldn't press the button, whereas trans people would. So it's like this counterfactual knowledge.
That's right. That's related to the Serrano thought experiment, which is if someone offered you $10 million to change sex, would you accept?
Yeah.
And if you're cisgendered, you will say, "Oh my God, no! That is absolutely repellent. That idea, and that's supposed to bring out the special attachment you have to your own gender." But I think, just as a matter of empirical fact, is just completely wrong. That ordinary people would be repelled at that thought. I mean, I would certainly press that button, especially if it wasn't, especially if I could press the button to reverse things if it wasn't working.
Yeah.
Out of curiosity.
And I think it's also a further wrinkle is, particularly getting into the topic of autogynephilia, which my audience as well, where I would talk about it all the time. But there's a sort of subcategory where the sort of classical case of that is you have this desire to embody the cisgender female body, including like you desire to have like the vagina, etc. But there's another case where the sort of like object of your internalized attraction is towards the transsexual body, such that your ideal body is actually this ambiguous combination of the penis and the breast, and that becomes the idealized body, such that this idea of like pressing the button to turn into the opposite sex, there's a good number of trans people who are quite happy having a sort of a recognizably identifiable transsexual body, and their identity is like very much grounded in like being trans itself, rather than grounded in like I'm this sort of like just the same as like a cisgender woman. And similarly, we're hearing all these new stories about these like kind of non-binary surgeries, such that you have vagina preserving phalloplasty, or penis preserving vaginoplasty, or something like this, and such that are we really confident that when we're doing these thought experiments that we're do we know? There seems to be a lot of diversity in how people would like ideally construct their own thought experiments. Like, what's their ideal body? It's like it's not clear that they just want to like turn into the quote unquote opposite sex. So
yeah, that's right. No, that's interesting. Do you think that's a recent thing?
I think
I mean, as far as the desire of, presumably you're talking about autogynephilic.
Yes, I think it is a more recent. I think it's been a more recent cohort that has become more prevalent. Whereas I think in the past, 30, 40 years ago, the only people who got through the gatekeeping system were the people that were the trans women who had strong anatomical autogynephilia, such that they are desirous of the full female body, including having a neo vagina installed. Whereas now I think and I have some speculation in regards to like why this newer cohort of the what's called the autogynoandromorphophilic type, such that you
Right.
have
Yeah.
the sort of paraphilic attraction to the transsexual body, and then you want to be that transsexual body. I think the influence of pornography and the proliferation of the exposure to that category is, I think, influential in the development. And then you couple that with like the ease of transition, informed consent, order hormones on the internet, and it's just like it just becomes so much easier. And also, there's just there's like this pipeline
Yeah.
that I've talked about on
Do
my
you think
channel.
that autogynandromorphophilia stands to gynandromorphophilia as autogynephilia stands to gynephilia? That is, if you're, suppose is it the case that for some men who are gynandromorphophiles, that is attracted to, well, I don't know what to call them. She-males is like pejorative. But,
Yes.
you can bleep that out. If that seems to be a genuine kind of sexual attraction, so perhaps you would expect it to have an inverted form.
Right. So in the sexological research, gynoandromorphophilia as a distinctive, attractive, I guess, a distinctive preference, they've done, phallometric studies in regards to distinguishing men who are gynoandromorphophilic versus, your more typical non-gynoandromorphophilic gynophile, who's just a regular heterosexual man. In the gynoandromorphophilic case, it's more strongly correlated, such that you score those men score higher on the core autogynephilia scale,
Oh, that is right. Yeah, no,
such that
yeah.
there's this correlation, such that if you are gynoandromorphophilic, you're often likely to be auto gynoandromorphophilic, which is why it's a common phenomenon in the trans community, such that the so-called chasers often end up transitioning themselves and they're only
Right.
dating the transgender women in order to sort of like live vicariously through them, because they're envious of them, or fascinated by them to some degree or another. That's a very common narrative. But I know we are running close to 2 hours, and I want to be sensitive to your time. And my final topic of conversation is, I wanted to ask you about, what is your perception of this sort of like general like culture within academic philosophy compared to, let's say, the height of the Kathleen Stock controversy? Because I remember when I was in grad school, there was this blog. I'm not sure if it existed, but they're called the Philosophy Smoker. It was like this anonymous philosophy blog.
Yeah, I don't think that blog exists anymore.
And in the comment sections, like, you would find people expressing a lot of, what would be considered gender critical perspectives in regards to these things, and sort of lamenting the fact that they can't speak non-anonymously about this. But do you think that in the context of like free speech and like and academic freedom, that the situation has gotten more accepting of like free speech on this topic? Or do you think that the level of like censorship on this topic, and I know you've run into trouble recently, and so is Holly Lawford Smith, about publishing. So I mean, certainly censorship is still alive and well, but do you think the climate or the temperature is like changing? Or if you had to stick your finger in the air and like sense or is like the wind changing on this topic in your perspective, like broadly in the culture of academic philosophy?
Good question. I mean, I think things have definitely improved somewhat, but they're still pretty bad. I think it's because feminist philosophy, that branch of philosophy that considers questions of interest to feminists, in particular, what is a woman, sort of went so far down the path of intolerance during the Kathleen Stock days. All the dissenters were essentially purged, that for the foreseeable future, there's no real going back. And there's no other branch of philosophy where these questions are discussed, at least at any great length. So I think, yeah, for the foreseeable future, the picture is still fairly bleak. I mean, just to give you an example, the MIT Free Speech Association, which is this alumni group, recently organized a debate at MIT on, well, it was notionally on whether sex is binary, but it was just about sex and gender generally. And I was on one team with Holly Lawford Smith, and of course we tried, or rather the organizers tried, very, very hard to get people on the other side who are really opposed to anything that Holly and I say. We really wanted to make it a debate. And unsurprisingly, all the people that they asked, I mean, some of whom were prominent feminist philosophers. I mean, you could probably think of the usual names yourself. They all declined. I mean, sometimes just explicitly giving as a reason that they just wouldn't want to give Polly and me airtime, or this entire issue is not worthy of debate. I mean, the official question was something like, oh yeah, that's right. No, I just remembered what the official question was. It's something like, the official motion for debate was sex is binary and gender identity is no substitute for sex in social policy. It was pretty bland stuff. It's extremely bland. It certainly wasn't about whether trans women are women, or about gender affirming care, or any super hot button issue like that. I mean, surely it's well within the Overton window to debate whether intact male rapists should be housed in the female prison estate. But anyway, despite the fact that it was pretty milquetoast, the official motion was nothing exceptional or offensive or anything like that. It proved impossible to get mainstream feminist philosophers to appear on the other side, and that was very recently. And so in the end, we ended up with Alice Drager. God bless her. But of course, Alice, believes in autogynephilia and has all sorts of other verboten views. Yeah. And Aaron Kimberley, who's a trans man, who very gamely agreed to take part, even though he really turned out to be on Holly's and my side at the end of the day.
Right.
But right. So that's just I have many other stories like that to illustrate.
Yeah. Do you have a sense from talking with people, colleagues informally, sort of like in the sort of hallways of academia, at the, that there's sort of like a silent majority of people who are more sympathetic to the Holly Lawford Smiths and Kathleen Stocks and yourself?
Oh, I think the vast majority of well, for a start, probably the vast majority of philosophers are not particularly interested in this issue and don't know very much about it. But I'm pretty sure that the vast, or at least a majority of philosophers are appalled at the way people like Kathleen and Holly were treated, and think the discipline should be much more hospitable to dissenting voices. And of course, it's all very ironic that these council people are women, whereas one of the terrible things about philosophy supposedly is that it's a majority male discipline, and the number one imperative has been to get more women into the profession.
Right.
But of course, obviously not women with the wrong opinions. That's very bad.
Yeah, you can't
So
do
it is
that.
a bit depressing. And I mean, another thing that's interesting, just touching on gender affirming care. I mean, I'm writing a paper with the philosopher Moti Goran on this at the moment. Is that, you know, for the most part, philosophers have somewhat mysteriously steered clear of controversies about gender affirming care, but whenever they have put their head above the parapet and said something about it, it's always been like very positive and orthodox, and yeah, this is wonderful, and puberty blockers, suicide prevention, and so on. And now, you know, the wheels seem to be coming off that train. It'll be interesting to see whether this is acknowledged in feminist philosophy at all. I sort of suspect it won't be.
Right.
I mean, that's another thing that you might have thought would have been of extreme interest to feminist philosophers in particular. But
yeah, I mean, there's people like Andrea Long Chu who are putting out these very interesting philosophical, or like Florence Ashley, these strong arguments that are based not on this sort of like traditional born in the wrong body, but the more morphological freedom, body autonomy, which is
embodiment,
which is I think that's the future of the transactivist argumentation, which is going to be interesting, because I think it's, in my opinion, it's going to necessarily involve some degree of interjecting like normativity from the concept of health, and like, what does it mean to have like a normative health concept? Like, can we give a normative concept of what it means to be a healthy body, or is it just like a free for all and we're just like these meat machines and we can like modify them like a Mr. Potato Head any way we want? It's like,
that's right. That's right. Yeah. It does involve a radical change in the sort of traditional way you think of healthcare.
Right. You know, is like puberty is like
curing some illness, but
right. Is like puberty fundamentally healthy or not? Well, you know, they'll say like, well, it's not healthy for the trans person, but that kind of necessitates either getting rid of the concept of health and, you know, more traditional teleological, that it's good to remain in homeostasis. It's like good to have bodily integrity. It's good to, you know, not be dependent on pharmaceutical, interventions, all things considered, if you can avoid that. It's sort of more traditional, like, but it's just, I think transactivists like sort of sniff any whiff of teleology in our normative concept about health and just say like, oh, well, that's metaphysical. Like, where would you get that from? You're just, transphobic or something. So I do think that's like a really fascinating area of philosophy. I'm really looking forward to yours and Moti's paper on this, because I think this is like the new vanguard of debate on the topic.
Yeah.
But I know we are almost at 2 hours, and you've been very very, very generous with your time today, and this has been a really interesting conversation. So where can people?
I should say, sorry, just before we end, I wanted to get in on your podcast the fact that you, at least in the person of your alter ego Rachel, were heavily cited in this new book published by Polity, my publisher, the publisher of Trouble with Gender. This new book is called Real Gender, a cis defense of trans realities, or trans reality or something. And your Rachel is cited for her wisdom on all sorts of matters related to trans. So
they should talk to Ray.
Extremely funny,
and see what Ray has to think about that.
You have made it. You made a substantial contribution to the.
I finally did it.
That's not one that's. You're now.
That is hilarious, because if you track down those references to those Medium articles, I put a disclaimer on all of them saying that I've changed my mind.
Yeah.
So that is sort of like, that is like particularly funny to me.
Yeah. Anyway, you should seek out this book when I think it's going to be published very, very shortly.
Okay, interesting. There's also this there's like this Catholic philosopher named Jake Thibault, I think that's how you, or Thibault, who published a book. It's like an 800-page massive tome on like a sort of Catholic response to transgender ideology, and he's like a PhD in philosophy.
Oh, interesting.
And I interviewed on his channel because I am in his book as Rachel, as one of the interlocutors that he debates with as far as like dealing with transgender activists. And I remember we talked back when I was Rachel about like we got into all these debates, and then now like I changed my mind, and so I like it's just one of these like funny like ironic things.
Yeah.
Well, what are you working on next, and where can people find you? And you want to plug your book, or talk about what you're
Okay, well, you can find me at alexbyrne.org, where you can you find all my public writings on sex and gender and details about the book, which you can buy on Amazon for, I think, a fairly reasonable price at the moment. And I'm working on some other sex and gender related things, including this paper with Moti that I mentioned. And I'm on leave in the fall, and I'm going to take most of the time trying to finish a book on philosophy of mind, which is really my main interest.
yeah, you kind of got sidetracked.
But it's the sex and gender thing that's got me on podcasts, not the philosophy of mind.
Yeah, funny how that works out.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your time, and that's it for today. I'm gonna end the recording now. Thank you.